Hello, this is the World in 20th Century podcast, and I'm your professor, Adam Foley. History.
Lesson 2, Chapter 8, Coexistence and Confrontation. Chapter 8 examines developments of the early Cold War, from the Suez Crisis, the Berlin Wall, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The chapter begins by exploring the shift in defense policy in the new Republican Eisenhower administration in the United States. This so-called New Look sought to increase military power, but also to reduce military expenditure. This would be achieved by reducing the size of America's conventional forces, that is, the numbers of men and equipment of the American Army and Navy, and instead rely more on the importance of the country's nuclear arsenal and the methods of delivery. At this time, it meant nuclear weapons delivered by bomber planes rather than nuclear-equipped missiles. In the early 1950s, the Soviets were far outmatched by the Americans in terms of the number of long-range bombers which could deliver nuclear attacks on Soviet targets. Thus, the USA had the great advantage. One of the important trends in Europe after the war was an increasing move towards closer military, economic, and political ties, which would reach the high point eventually with the creation of the EU, or European Union. During the 1950s, there were growing concerns about the defense of Western Europe, with the Soviet Empire on its borders. As the text discusses, there were various defense pacts such as the Brussels Pact, and eventually West Germany was given full membership in NATO in 1955, which led to the formation of the rival Soviet defense pact, the Warsaw Pact. The map on page 221 of the textbook shows the divisions of Europe with NATO countries, Warsaw Pact nations, neutral countries, and the anomalies of Yugoslavia and Albania, who were communist countries but not Warsaw Pact nations. In 1953, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died after nearly 3 decades in charge of the nation. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, came to power after several years of outmaneuvering his rivals, and he was largely responsible for the mild thaw in the Cold War. In 1955, Khrushchev met with Eisenhower and other Western leaders in Geneva, the first summit or meeting of the powers in the post-war world. In 1957, at the Communist Party Congress, the main meeting of the ruling party in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev rejected Stalin's contention that communist and capitalist powers would inevitably go to war, claiming instead that peaceful coexistence was still possible. Khrushchev also famously denounced Stalin's cult of personality. That is, he told the Soviet Communist Party that Stalin had erred by making worship of himself an acceptable thing rather than the worship of the nation or the party. The Soviet thaw, in fact, threatened to erode the Soviet Union's communist bloc in Eastern Europe. In the Polish case, as noted in the text, Khrushchev backed down. But in the case of Hungary, the Soviets crushed the Hungarian attempt at liberalizing communism. Just as the Americans saw the spread of communism as a threat that, like a series of dominoes, when one country turned communist, it could set in chain in events that would affect neighboring countries turning communist, so too did the Soviets fear that a liberalizing regime in one area of the Soviet bloc, like Hungary, could spread to other areas and thereby undermine the Soviet security zone in Europe. Also in Europe, the Berlin question had not been settled. The blockade failed to drive the Western powers out of Berlin as the Soviets had hoped, and worse, West Germany had actually joined NATO. In 1962, one of the iconic symbols of the Cold War was built in Berlin, the Berlin Wall. The fact that there was a Western capitalist presence in Berlin, West Berlin, which was deep inside East Germany, and hence the Soviet fear, was a perpetual irritant for the Soviet Union and its satellite nations. Berlin was also the weakest part of Western Europe, the most vulnerable, as it was located within Eastern Europe, East Germany. Berlin again became the focus of East-West tensions in the late 1950s, when Khrushchev abruptly demanded the evacuation of all Western forces, from Berlin within 6 months. The Soviets had, and the East Germans had, good reason to be concerned about the Western occupation of Berlin. They had been there since the end of World War II. One element of the problem was the so-called economic miracle of West Germany. People in West Germany, the capitalist and democratic German nation, had a much higher standard of living than people did living in the socialist and one-party state East Germany. The fear of the Soviets and East Germans was being realized, as East Germans voted for prosperity with their feet. Within a decade or so after the war, more than 2 million East Germans defected to the much less repressive and better off West Germany. More importantly, a large proportion of these peoples were highly skilled professionals, the defection of whom threatened the economic growth and future of West Germany. By 1958, the long border separating the two Germanys was sealed, but the brain drain continued through the last hole in the Iron Curtain, Berlin. If East Germans could get to West Berlin, then they had made it to West Germany. The Western powers did not give in to Khrushchev's ultimatum over Berlin. However, in 1961, the problem was solved. In August of 1961, Berliners awoke to find East German workers building a wall to divide East and West Berlin. Ground floor windows were boarded up, and even telephone lines to West Berlin were cut. The wall did its job. During the first 6 months of 1961, that is, before the wall went up, over 100,000 East Germans fled to West Berlin. Thereafter, once the wall had been created, the annual total was around 6,000. Moving on from Berlin to the Suez Crisis, we turn to Egypt. Egypt had gained nominal independence from Britain back in 1922, but there was still an imperial presence with British troops guarding the essential waterway, the Suez Canal. In 1952, there was a revolution in Egypt, and King Farouk was overthrown by an army coup led by General Gamal Abdel Nasser, who became the country's new president. Nasser saw great things for Egypt's future, desiring it to become the dominant force in a pan-Arab movement in the Middle East and North Africa, which would unify the Arab world. There were, however, 3 obstacles in his way. One was the colonial presence of French control in Algeria. The second was the Jewish state of Israel and the Palestinian refugee crisis. And the third was the remaining British colonial presence in Egypt. In October 1954, Nasser obtained a pledge from the British to relinquish its rights to maintain a military base on the essential waterway, the Suez Canal, and also to evacuate the canal zone entirely within 20 months. In exchange, Egypt promised Britain guaranteed freedom of navigation through the Suez Canal, and promised to allow British forces immediate re-entry to the canal zone in the event of an armed outside attack. In June 1956, the British formally terminated their 74-year occupation of the Suez Canal, leaving Egypt fully responsible for the canal's defense. Very soon, however, the British forces would be back invading the canal zone, following Nasser's move to nationalize the canal company. President Nasser's ambitious Aswan Dam project led Egypt to nationalizing the Suez Canal. Once he had lost American financial assistance because of an arms deal concluded with a Soviet bloc nation. The canal company, the Suez Canal Company, was largely owned by European shareholders, and the British and French governments also wanted to overthrow Nasser and to install a more favorable regime. For France, this was particularly important because of the assistance Nasser was giving to Arabs in the region and to Algeria in particular. Thus, the joint invasion of Egypt by France, Britain, and Israel was easily achieved, but was soon abandoned as the United States forced France and Britain to withdraw. Tensions between Egypt and Israel did not ease. There was no peace settlement after the 1956 war, and so both sides geared up for the next war, which came in June 1967, once United Nations peacekeepers were withdrawn from Egyptian territory. Regarding the Cold War, other areas were hotspots. In the Western Hemisphere, this was most poignantly seen with Cuba. In the Western Hemisphere, the Americans had relied upon an old policy doctrine that went back to the 19th century. The Monroe Doctrine from 1823 stated that the Western Hemisphere was the preserve of the United States, and that European empires no longer made decisions that governed international relations in the Western Hemisphere. During the early 19th century, there was a wave of independence movements in Latin America, by which nations gained their independence from European countries. With this, the Americans promulgated the Monroe Doctrine, which warned Europe against attempting to reassert its colonial system in the New World, arguing instead that the Western Hemisphere was the preserve of the Americans. And this was one of the background reasons why, for example, America went to war with Spain in 1898 to control the island of Cuba. Cuba figured prominently in early Cold War, and of course, the missile crisis of the autumn of 1962 brought the world to the brink of the threat of nuclear war. From the 1930s to the 1950s, the Cuban government was dominated by Batista. Backed by the U.S. government, he was eventually overthrown during the Cuban Revolution by a small army of guerrillas led by Fidel Castro. Batista fled the country, and Fidel Castro seized power and implemented a social revolution in Cuba. In order to make life better for ordinary Cubans, the government seized land and assets of foreign companies in Cuba, especially large American ones, and it also raised wages for workers and so on. The American government was less than pleased to have a socialist nation on its doorstep, and one which confiscated land and property from U.S. companies. The American attempt at regime change in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion, was a disaster. Drawn up under the Eisenhower administration, but implemented under President Kennedy's government, the plan was for the CIA to train an army of Cuban refugees in Florida and other Latin American countries. This refugee army would then invade Cuba and spark a nationalist revolt against Castro, thereby overthrowing this socialist revolution. In April of 1961, the forces invaded but sparked no revolt, and the entire force was killed or captured. The invasion was a great embarrassment for Kennedy, and, in fact, drove Cuba much closer to the Soviets. The Cubans feared that this was just the first of more attempts to come by the Americans for regime change. Consequently, Moscow finally agreed to Castro's request for military protection from the Americans, and thus Soviet missiles were planted on Cuba, and their discovery sparked the crisis of October 1962, discussed in the text.